Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology. Hello, I'm Alex Kuksha.
And I'm Dr. Kate King. In this episode, we talk to Beth Kurland about a number of mental habits humans developed as a result of evolution, but which create suffering for us in the modern world. Beth shares 5 practical tools to help us work with these habits to improve our well-being. Beth Kurland is a clinical psychologist, a Tedx speaker, and author of 3 award-winning books, Dancing on the Tightrope, The Transformative Power of 10 Minutes, and Gifts of the Rain Puddle. Dr. Kurland has been providing evidence-based therapy to people across the lifespan for over 25 years.
We recorded this episode before the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent wave of protests. We have been deeply affected by the events of the last week and would like to express our commitment to racial justice and our intention to explore these topics on the show. For now, we hope the information Beth shares will be useful during this painful time. You can get this episode's show notes and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
We are here with Beth Kurland. Thank you so much for joining us on Noble Mind today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
Great, thanks. Why don't you start off maybe by just telling us a little bit about yourself and maybe introduce yourself to our listeners and maybe a little bit about your work and your interests.
Sure. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a practice in Norwood, Massachusetts, and I wear a couple of different hats. So my psychology practice, I've written 3 books. I love to do public speaking as well. My interest in psychology really goes back to 11th grade when I think I found my calling, taking a social psychology class and getting to be a mentor for a younger student. And that really sparked my interest in clinical psychology. And it was kind of a straight path with that going forward. And then really becoming interested in meditation and mindfulness over the years, and I can talk more about that, but really became a path for me that has truly been transformative in my life.
As you say that, I just remembered that I had a class in high school as well. I hadn't thought about that in years. I found a book about psychoanalysis at a library book sale, and that was what hooked me in psychology in high school. So it just was connecting to those high school experiences.
Yeah.
So your most recent book, titled Dancing on the Tightrope, talks about 5 habits of mind that people tend to get stuck in. Can we review those and share a bit about them with our audience?
Sure. I guess just to give a quick framework, that these habits of mind share a few things in common. And one is that in some ways they all evolved to help us survive as a species. So really evolving over millions of years, wired into our biology, into our conditioned automatic reactivity that has helped us survive as a species. And the other thing that they share in common is that often this is where we default to when left to our own devices, so to speak. And these habits of mind are things that I have really experienced in my own life and in my clinical practice. And I think they're things that we all experience as human beings. Sometimes there's a continuum, so some we may experience as more challenging than others, but there's really a universality of these. And so the first one is what I call the false alarm. I was really thinking when I use this term of a smoke alarm in one's house. And this idea that our smoke alarm is designed to go off when there's a life-threatening fire, but it often will go off, at least in my house, we burn a piece of toast, that kind of thing.
When the battery's dying.
And that smoke alarm doesn't always know the difference.
Right.
And so we have wired into our brain this part of our brain, this more primitive part of our brain, that really scans our environment for danger. And that when we perceive a threat, it sets off this whole cascade of physiological responses in our body, this classic fight or flight response, our stress response, that prepares us to fight from a predator or flee, or in some cases to freeze. And this is a very adaptive and normal and healthy response specifically to external physical threats, which is really what it evolved for. But in our modern day lives, we can experience this for all the kinds of stressors that we face today. And while these stressors are some of them can be quite challenging and very real, the fighting or fleeing is not always the most helpful way to approach or respond to those challenges. And that being said, I really want to emphasize that stress itself is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. That stress can mobilize us, it can energize us, it can help us perform at our peak. Mm-hmm. And it's a normal part of our day-to-day living. But when we get caught in chronic stress, when we don't have ways for it to reset, when our sympathetic nervous system gets turned on and can't get turned off or is dialed up too high, we can get caught in these states of reactivity, of narrow-mindedness. Our mind really does narrow as we go into more of that fight or flight mode. So it's harder to see clearly what might be needed in order to help us meet the challenges at hand.
I think that's a great point, because it's so easy when we're in fight or flight response to really want to fix the problem like now. Like I'm in a stress response, I got to deal with this. And then, but we're not really at our best in terms of decision making. Like you're saying, like our minds do kind of narrow. We can't take in the bigger view or come up with those great creative ideas. It's just sort of like that skill seems lost to us when we're at our most stressed out. Yeah.
And there's a term that I think Daniel Goleman may have coined, this neural hijacking that happens in the brain, when this higher cortical part of our brain kind of shuts down. And that makes sense when we're being chased by a tiger. We're not going to have time to really sit and process and wonder about things, but we just, that narrow tunnel vision helps us survive. Yeah. And I think it's really all about learning how to pay attention to this signal. So it's not about getting rid of stress, which I think is impossible, or even, this response, really just learning to befriend it in a way where we can listen to those signals in a way that can really help us see what is needed in the moment. Mm-hmm. So that's our first evolutionary challenge.
Right.
I think people may think of stress as just sort of a very unpleasant experience, but it's actually a lot worse than that, because it affects our ability to perceive things, to be broad-minded and have perspective and be effective. So it's not just, I hate being stressed out.
Yeah, I think it can. When it gets really heightened, it can really, shut down our ability to think more clearly. I think that, again, in and of itself, there's some interesting research that stress can be helpful for us in some ways. So I think it depends on how we're experiencing it. And in particular, there's some research of looking at really perceiving stress as challenge versus threat. Mm-hmm. That when we can see things more as a challenge, we're able to access the resources more effectively. So it's really some way how we're viewing it, how we're relating to it, and I think that's where the mindfulness comes in.
Mm-hmm. About the fight, flight, freeze response, you point out that, for instance, getting angry is a form of the fight response. So even if we're not saying anything, we're in the fight mode. And avoiding and procrastinating behaviors are part of the flight response, even though we may think of them as doing nothing. And self-isolating is a form of the freeze response.
Yeah, that there's these modern ways, I think, that we respond to those inner signals. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the fight or flight response is sort of designed to help us, like you're saying, outrun a predator or something, not like think through really complicated problems.
And I think just being able, again, to pay attention to these signals, to the physical sensations in our body, to the thoughts, to the emotions that are present, and really noticing our behaviors and learning to use those pieces of information to guide us in a helpful way to see what is needed. And I think also importantly, again, not to see this stress response as a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I try to remind myself in some ways, really thanking this primitive part of my brain for trying to protect me,
Mm-hmm.
and reminding myself that I have more newly evolved parts of my brain that can help me self-soothe, that can help comfort me, that can help give me a bigger perspective in times when I feel challenged.
Yeah, and even this idea of interpreting things as a threat versus a challenge, and if everything gets interpreted as a threat, it would be easy to just want to do nothing but sit on the couch all day. But if it felt like, oh, this is a challenge I can try to rise to, and maybe I get a stress response as I'm, trying to do something like that. Like even now doing an interview, it's, there's a performance aspect of it. So we're activated to some extent, but it's also, hopefully to an appropriate level, And
I think really being able to see that and name that. So in fact, I love public speaking, but there are times when I certainly get anxious and my heart is pounding out of my chest. And when I can recognize, oh, that's just my false alarm.
Right.
That's just my body, trying to protect me and looking out, okay, these people are not really predators. It helps me to embrace it. I don't have to make that go away.
Right.
But I can relate to it in a different way. Right. And I think that's where it becomes helpful.
You work this into the book where every time one of the 5 challenges arises and you notice it, you reframe it as an opportunity to apply or use some of the 5 tools that you're presenting.
I tried to emphasize, I think, in the book, this idea that each of these challenges, these mental habits, really are opportunities for us to grow inner resources. It's not about getting rid of these mental habits. We can't, we won't. They are wired in there, but it's really about bringing awareness to them. And as we do that, it shifts our relationship to them, and it offers us greater choice. We can step out of our automatic reactivity, and we can really, again, choose what may be most helpful or needed for us.
And as I was looking at the challenges as you list them in your book, in this idea that they are wired in, they've been part of our evolutionary, like they've been helpful to us for various reasons over thousands of years. So there's something kind of freeing about not having to battle to get rid of them. Like, I'm not going to try to get rid of the false alarm. I'm not going to try to get rid of, the dial and, some of these other ones we'll talk about. I don't have to have that battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. And in fact, I really am coming from this place of we are already whole.
Mm-hmm.
There is an innate wholeness and an innate ability for us to bring and maybe talk about the tools, but I'll just bring this universal tool that really to work with all these mental habits is what I call the flashlight. And it really is a metaphor for mindful awareness. But, I sometimes use this example that imagine if you were walking around in a pitch black room and there were obstacles, furniture, and so forth. You're trying to get from point A to point B. And in a pitch black room, you'd be bumping over things, you'd be tripping. It would be kind of challenging. But if somebody handed you a flashlight, suddenly the room is illuminated and you can see more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And so the flashlight is really a reminder and this metaphor for how do we bring mindful awareness into our lives? How do we help the flashlight help us to see the mental habits that we get entangled in so that we're no longer entangled? And when we're stepping back, when we're observing what's there, there's a powerful shift that occurs that allows us to relate to what's there in a different way.
And speaking of metaphors, what does it mean to dance on the tightrope?
Oh, that's interesting. And I have to say, nobody has ever asked me that, which is really interesting. I've talked a lot about
evocative
my book. Yeah.
Yes.
So I was in Boston watching this amazing performance of Cirque du Soleil with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. And there were these amazing tightrope performers. And I just think a lot in images. But the image for me is really about life is challenging. We are constantly juggling multiple balls in the air, and it's not about not falling, and it's not about needing to keep perfect balance, but how do we get back up again after we fall? And how do we learn to dance on the tightrope, even though life has these sometimes immense challenges that we face as human beings? And yet, how do we find that cultivating the ability to dance nonetheless? And to me, there's a real joyful quality in dancing, but I think that joy is also about embracing the wholeness of who we are, and not only precious moments of our lives, but also some of our own deep suffering.
This idea of dropping the balls at times is inevitable, that we're going to fall off the rope, that's inevitable.
Yeah.
One of the things I really appreciated about all your 3 books really is your openness and honesty about, you have been on the therapist side of this process, but you also talk about how you've been on the client side. And that's very helpful, I think, for people to appreciate the common humanity, that those people who are instructing have similar challenges. So I think that's very helpful for everyone to hear, and healing and destigmatizing. So thank you.
I like to be open about my own experiences in that way because I think we all do share this common humanity that connects us all. And I think, one of the things that really drew me to mindfulness was trying to grapple with my own grief and suffering. My mom, as I mentioned in the book, she died when I was 15. So there was a lot of grief that I struggled with, and really trying to find a way to hold both the joys and the preciousness of life and our own suffering and pain and the difficulties that each of us go through.
Yeah, I think that we can relate to this idea of being on a tightrope. The dancing sometimes feels a little less accessible, but it's aspirational,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it creates that vivid feeling, and of even just trying to balance, if you're out walking on a curb or something, let alone on a tightrope, like, that if you just focus on don't fall, that's not going to help. You need to bring your attention other places and focus on other things. And then having that ability to actually enjoy yourself and have some lightness and movement and all that dancing kind of brings with it as a metaphor. It sort of straddles that divide very nicely.
And I think there's some freedom when we can see the mental habits that we get entangled in.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can shift to more of a place of observing and noticing what's there is a bit of a freedom and lightness that can come with that.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to acknowledge, because I know we are recording this in the midst of this pandemic that is occurring, and there's so much suffering that people are experiencing right now. And I may be able to touch upon this with any of the mental habits that I talk about, but certainly this false alarm is one that, and I've really been thinking about this in the past months. When I say false, it's not that it's not real. The anxiety that people are feeling, that the stress that people are feeling is very real. But it's about, how do we hold that? How do we work with that? How do we nonetheless step out of our automatic reactivity so that we can access ways of self-soothing and self-comforting, and especially in this time? And thinking about some of my own experiences recently of just the 4 a.m., 3 a.m. waking up with panic or anxiety, this heart racing, and the fear that I think all of us, maybe in our own ways, have experienced. And yet recognizing, at least for me, when I can say to myself, thank you, primitive brain, for trying to help protect me, and kind of putting that hand on my heart and going to my breathing and really connecting in with what's here right now in this moment, and trying to then think about, how can I also access and invite in something else that can be comforting, that can be soothing, to remind me of what's right here. now, and just the comfort, the love, care of friends, family, whatever that might be.
Mm-hmm.
And the tools we can use to counter the 5 challenges are not only antidotes, but also help us grow toward a fuller life, toward a deepening of our experience of life. Then the second challenge you talk about is the dial being stuck in an unhelpful place. Would you like to say a few things about that?
Sure, yeah. Again, I think in pictures and images, and so this is a little bit of really me simplifying the brain science here. But if you imagine a dial, two positions, in one position that we are fully present, awake, aware in our lives, that we are right here in this moment. And the second setting is we're in a mind-wandering mode, where we're thinking about the past, we're thinking about the future, we're caught in self-referential thinking. And a lot of the time, in fact, one study from Harvard that has been cited a lot estimates that about 50% of the time when we're not focused on a specific task at hand, we're in the mind-wandering mode. And so we can walk around throughout much of our lives on automatic pilot. And this can show up in multiple different ways. But one is just being lost in thought, just thinking about, oh, what do I have to do next, and so forth, and missing some of these precious moments that are right here. I mean, I think it can also show up, and often does for myself, for the people that I work with, and I think, again, very relevant to this pandemic, in terms of getting caught in either mental reruns, playing things from the past, or more specific probably to this time right now, really the mental rehearsals, the what ifs, the ruminations that can pull us away from maybe this moment starting to play out scenarios that can really create a lot of anxiety and additional suffering beyond what may be right here in this moment.
The word presence came up a lot in the book. Could you tell us a bit about that? What does it mean to be present?
In some ways, it's the opposite of the mind wandering. I heard somebody say, and maybe it was Tara Brach, this idea of our mind and body being in the same place at the same time. And that
what a nice idea.
Yeah, often it doesn't happen. We're going for a walk in nature at a beautiful place, and we're thinking about, I don't know, the 10 things we have to do later. So the opposite of that is really about, it's an embodied experience. Presence is a very embodied experience of being in our bodies, being present to our senses. What is here right now? What are we seeing? What are we hearing? What are we feeling in our bodies? It's really bringing this quality of mindful awareness into these moments of our lives. And just to emphasize moments, because some of my meditation teachers have said this idea of small moments many times.
Mm-hmm.
It would be wonderful if we could just be present all the time, but I certainly don't know anybody who is able to do that. But if we can really think about using this flashlight, so that was one of the tools that I talk about, and it's really, again, just a reminder, a metaphor for bringing awareness to this mental habit. And when we catch ourselves in the mind-wandering mode, and when we can see that, when that light of awareness can help us see that, it's a reminder to come back, to just come back. What is here? What is present right now? What is it that I can touch in with that is happening in this moment? And when we are present, the research also seems to show that we are happier.
That makes sense, right? Because when we're doing the reruns of the past or the rehearsals for the future, which are, those are phrases you use in your book, which I love, we're not so much here. And it's often, sometimes we're rerunning or, planning for things that are great, like we're planning a vacation we're excited about, or we're reflecting on something that was wonderful. But typically, it's more likely that what we're thinking about in the past is something that went wrong, or that we're, feel bad about, or something, or what we're imagining in the future is something that's, that we're afraid of, that we feel like we have to prepare and rehearse for 1,000 times over, and then just, end up, like, as you're saying, not present in the here and now, and not experiencing as much joy, as maybe we could if we came back here.
And sometimes I do want to add, sometimes what's here is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And that really gets us to another mental habit. And I think these all kind of work together, but this idea of, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit in my book, or, the
okay.
sequence there, but this idea of the finger trap dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
I call it, and this is really borrowed from an ACT metaphor, ACT being acceptance and commitment therapy. But if you think about one of those little gag toys where you'd stick your fingers on the two ends, and then the harder you pull to try to get out, the more stuck you get.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of this spoiler alert, but the way to get out of this little finger trap is actually to turn inward, to push your fingers inward. And so one of our mental habits, this evolutionary wiring, is that we're wired to seek pleasure and to avoid pain. And that served our ancestors well when they were avoiding painful experiences like getting bitten by a lion or eating a poisonous plant or whatnot. But the kinds of pain that we often try to avoid in our modern lives is more internal, our own emotions, our own thoughts, our own physical sensations. And when we try to push that away or escape that, it often, in the long run, doesn't work so well. And so there's a way in which, going back to the stuck dial, sometimes what's here may be difficult, and how do we hold a space for that? How do we learn to be present with some of our more difficult emotions as well?
Yeah, that's really timely right now. Thanks for highlighting that, because it is easy, especially I think in sort of mindfulness realms, to talk about being present like it's this blissful thing.
Yeah.
But especially now, being present and, to our experience and to what's going on in the world in any given moment can be really challenging. And the impulse of experiential avoidance is pretty strong, whether it's just whatever our specialized ways are of avoiding things, of trying to avoid pain and keep ourselves comfortable. Yeah.
And I think certainly at this time, with the challenges that people are facing, even just to be able to name what they're feeling,
mm-hmm.
to be able to acknowledge it. And really, I think there's so much importance of connecting with others
mm-hmm.
and being able to share what one is experiencing and to have it held by another person, and learning how to hold our own suffering and turn towards some of these parts of ourselves with self-compassion. Because
mm-hmm.
our tendency often is, I shouldn't be feeling this way, or what's wrong with me that I'm feeling this? And we can disown whole parts of ourselves sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I certainly, from my own personal experience, this has been such a powerful piece of my own growth, I think, in terms of really learning how to turn towards what's there, the grief, the sadness, the anger, whatever it might be, and holding it in a compassionate space.
It seems, as you're right, when people have difficulties, when we have difficulties, it can be easy for us to go to the idea, oh, since I'm having this difficulty, there must be something wrong with me. I'm crazy, defective, broken. Whereas that's a universal experience. Everybody has all these difficulties and wonders at times if something's wrong with them, but that's just being human.
Yeah, I think there's such a power in learning how to, and it's a lifelong process, I think, for most of us, to really learn how to be present with some of these parts of us that we would rather push away or get rid of or pretend they weren't there or whatnot. But when we can hold them in a compassionate way, the way we might turn towards a dear friend and sit with a friend and just be present when that friend is expressing how they're feeling, that it's not something that we learn how to do, I think,
mm-hmm.
in our schooling, in our growing up. And yet I have seen that the capacity, I think it's something we all can do. It's innate. We all have this innate compassion, but to learn to do it towards ourselves can be really transformative for people.
So we've mentioned a few of the challenges: the false alarm, the dial in the unhelpful place, the finger trap. And I have to say, we haven't mentioned this yet, but you also write poetry, and you mentioned you think visually. And I think that these metaphors really, demonstrate that, that part of you. And I actually think they're super helpful because they immediately create a visual, or like a simple pithy reference point, like, oh, flashlight practice, or, oh, false alarm moment, or, it gives you something that you can, that distills the essence of like something that can seem really abstract and conceptual into something very pragmatic and accessible. So I think that's a great strength of all the, both the way you frame the challenges as well as the tools that you're offering people too.
You make concrete these complex concepts.
Yeah.
That's my goal. Yeah, that's my goal is really, and again, I think in images, so it's helped me.
Yeah.
And really trying to think about with all of my books, this idea of how to make it accessible for people, try to make some of these concepts accessible. And I think about it really as sort of a greatest hits album of my books in terms of pulling together some of the things that I've found to be most helpful and transformative, and try to put them in a tangible way that people can bring into their lives, even in small ways, even in small moments.
That makes it easier to think about them and also easier to access them in moments of stress.
Yeah.
Quite complex concepts. Yes.
We use the metaphor, I think in therapy, at least I do a lot, and I think other therapists do as well, of the toolbox, right? Like I have a toolbox of coping skills, and what's in the toolbox? And so I think the visual metaphors of like, I've got a flashlight, I've got a magnifying glass, I've got like, now I have things in the toolbox, that are just as concrete and accessible visually.
And when I give talks, I actually carry a little toolbox with me. And in the toolbox, I have a flashlight.
Perfect.
And I have, the two mental habits that I didn't talk about, one is the noisy person in the movie theater. And, if you think about going into the movie theater, sitting down to enjoy your movie, you have this noisy person that plops himself next to you and starts giving you a running commentary of the whole movie. Oh my God, did you see that? That's going to be a disaster. Oh, can you believe she said that? That is so stupid. Oh God, I can't believe where this is going. This is not going to end well. And so you've got this whole narrator sitting next to you and you're just trying to enjoy your movie. And really, we have this inner dialogue in our own head. And these thoughts that we tell ourselves and these stories that we tell ourselves. And we believe our thoughts as absolute truth much of the time. I think it, therefore it's so. And when we believe our thoughts, when we get entangled in our thoughts and our stories, especially, stories, I'm not good enough, something missing, something wrong, something broken, then it can really add to the suffering that we experience in our lives. So that, in a nutshell, is the noisy person. And then the other one that I call affectionately the Velcro problem is one really inspired by some of Rick Hanson's work. Rick talks about the idea of our brains are like Velcro for the negative and Teflon for the positive experiences. And the negative ones stick to us and the positive ones can much more easily slip away. And again, evolutionary value in that for ancestors. But how do we work with that? How do we really try to find, not ignore, the negative or the challenging things that may be present, but also to find those little positive moments in our day, the strengths and in ourselves and others and in the world that we might otherwise miss, that can really, when we notice it, bring resilience into our day. And that's where I know, Kate, you had kind of mentioned the magnifying glass.
Right.
That was one of the tools that I talk about, especially to help with the Velcro problem. This idea of really remembering, to carry around a magnifying glass, and how do we magnify some of these little moments that otherwise we might not even notice, that can help us even in the face of big challenges.
Yeah, the Teflon Velcro is just such a good metaphor, and as you're saying that, I'm thinking I can trust my mind to remember the negative or the problems or the challenges, and it's got that, the Velcro feature to hang on to those things. So I don't need a magnifying glass for that. I can trust my mind to hang on to that stuff. But not so much with those positive or pleasant experience, right? I know the habit of my mind, not just my mind, but like our animal brain, to kind of discount those or just sort of let them brush off, or, they're not as central to our survival, at a basic level. So then I want to bring a tool in, like the magnifying glass, to make sure to emphasize and get a more balanced view, I guess, right, of what my reality is, which includes the challenges that stick around easily, mentally and emotionally, but also to make sure I'm taking in even the pleasant moments. I'm thinking about some, people I've been talking to recently who are, working with older adults right now. And, there's so many challenges and struggles, but can we remember that the flowers are blooming right now? It's May. Can you smell the flowering trees when you take your 10-minute walk on your break or something? And like, as you're saying, basically it's a magnifying glass practice, that sort of savoring of those good things.
Yeah. And I think, this idea of it's not about burying our heads in the sand or sort of positive talk as in everything's wonderful, if that's not how we're feeling. It's about really being true and authentic to whatever we're feeling, but nonetheless not missing those moments. And I don't remember if I shared this. I think I may have shared this in the book, but one powerful story around that comes up for me is my father several years ago went through some very serious health challenges, and thankfully he's actually doing very well right now. But at the time, he had just had 2 pretty close back-to-back hospitalizations and ended up in the emergency room, was left there for 4 hours before he was even seen. At that point, it had turned into this life-threatening situation where he had to have this emergency surgery. And I saw him like the day or 2 after that, and I went to visit him in the hospital. And I really expected that he would have been just going, talking about, my God, I can't believe this. I was left in the emergency room for 4 hours and here I am. Second time in the hospital in 2 weeks and all of that. And what he was talking about was, every time a nurse would come in, he would just say, oh, you know what, that's Sheila, and she has just been so helpful to me. Thank you so much. And just talking about how grateful he was for the nursing care. And it was really genuine, and it didn't at all take away the fear that he was feeling and then the difficulties that he was struggling with, but it somehow made that easier brought some ease to a very difficult moment. So that's what I think about, with the magnifying glass.
I mean, you recount in your TED Talk your father's piano incident. Was that a turning point for him?
He's talked about that story a lot. I love that story. I think it's such a great illustration of the Velcro problem. He was a teenager in the Bronx and was a piano student, and his piano teacher sent him to listen to this concert. She was unable to attend with him. There's these free concerts that were given. This one was by a world-class pianist playing Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. And my father sat there, and in the opening movement, he realized that the pianist had played 2 wrong notes. And he was so proud of himself that he had caught these mistakes. He couldn't wait to tell his teacher. He kind of burst through the door, and said to his teacher, I discovered these 2 wrong notes. And his piano teacher turned to him and asked him pointedly, did you bother to count the number of beautiful notes that he played? And I think it really did shift my father's perspective and the way he thought about things. And what is it that we want to notice? What is it that we want to magnify? There is a choice in that.
I'm having a kind of half-formed thought here, but as you're talking, I'm thinking about how, we tend to spend a lot of energy trying to avoid situations that are challenging or scary, or that we think might be stressful or high stakes. And yet when I've been in situations like that, as you're describing, dealing with a sick relative or like a life and death circumstance or like great tragedy, there is often this gratitude and appreciation for the efforts of people trying to help us, or this vividness of, I can sort of remember, the day a relative passed away and leaving the hospital and just feeling like, the leaves of the trees were never more green. There was just some sense of vividness and appreciation for life, that can come out of those really challenging hardships that you would put on your list of things I hope would never happen, kind of like, I wish I could avoid this pain. But there is something that activates, I think, in people and communities and families at those times too, that can be really beautiful.
Yeah, I have two thoughts when you said that. One was just this quick little flashback to, I remember my mother's burial.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a small cemetery. It is a small cemetery. And I was struck by the, and sometimes even going back there now, just the beauty of the sun falling on the trees and the life that's around, and sort of this way that she still, I think lives inside me. And so there's this fragility of life, but there's also this preciousness of life. And I think they're two sides of the same coin. And, and I think during this pandemic, this idea of the magnifying glass, I think, can be especially helpful because there's so much negative news around us. Again, it's not about burying our heads in sand or pushing anything away, but also what can we invite in that might be positive or uplifting in some way, just really appreciating the essential workers, so much kindness that's being shown, and really taking in those moments, whatever that might be.
Yeah, it's easy to miss that, I think, and again, easy to miss that because of our, perfectly normal, appropriate animal human impulse to, try to flee from danger, but yeah, there is a lot of generosity and kindness going on in the world right now. So a realistic view of what's happening in the world would include that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we kind of blasted through the noisy person in the movie theater. He's so annoying. Yeah. So maybe we can
say a word there.
But just, this is, sometimes people talk about this as kind of the inner critic idea, that there's sort of the narrator in your head. So we don't have to go into a lot of depth there, but maybe would that help us move into one of the tools that we could apply to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So the tool that I see is most directly tied to this one is what I call the diet. And I should say that the flashlight, really is universal for all of these mental habits and fundamental. It's really about seeing the mental habits as they're arising. So, from that space, we can then, it shifts our relationship to them. But in terms of the diet, this idea of feeding ourselves a diet of healthy thoughts. And I guess I will qualify that a little bit. Sometimes just simply noticing what is the diet that we're feeding ourselves and recognizing that our thoughts are mental constructs. And when we can take them more lightly and recognize that often our thoughts can be distorted, self-critical, inaccurate, untrue, just exaggerated at times, when we can see that, it can just step us again out of getting so entangled in our thoughts and believing them to be absolute truth. So I think there's some real power and value in that. And also sometimes then inviting in a different kind of a healthier diet. The diet that I really think about is a diet of accurate, specific, and self-compassionate thoughts. So can we make our language a little bit more accurate and specific to the circumstances at hand? And also more self-compassionate. Quick example, we make a mistake and say to ourselves, I'm such an idiot, I'm so stupid. That's a really global attack on our character and not particularly accurate. And so can we more acknowledge something specific? I'm really upset that in this particular moment, I made a mistake here that I wish I hadn't done. So we can acknowledge it, but we can be more specific and accurate in our language. And then also self-compassionate and recognizing, yes, this is part of our common humanity. And we can then, okay, how do I learn from this rather than beating myself up about it?
You identify 5 challenges and 5 tools, and all the tools are helpful for all the challenges. And it seems the flashlight is helpful for all of them. It stands out. But then some of them are also helpful for particular challenges. You map that out in your book.
Yeah. And I think the flashlight is really, again, the most universal. And the other tool that I would say is really universal to all of the mental habits that I didn't talk about is the tool of the beacon. And this idea, again, sort of me being very visual, of this beacon of light that guides ships to come safely into harbor, and this idea that ships will veer off course, but with that beacon of light in front of them, it helps to guide them to come back, on course. And this idea that each of us really has, I think, a beacon, our own guiding light, which is really our deepest values. What is it that is most important to us? And when we can connect in with those values, that can really help to guide us, help us to navigate some of these mental challenges that we can get entangled in, and make choices that are aligned with our values, even though we might be experiencing that false alarm going off, or we might have some negative voice in the back of our head, or we might be pulled into some negativity of the Velcro problem. Nonetheless, when we hold out those values, we can choose who we want to be in this moment and how we want to act.
It feels like that also would connect to what we were just saying about the diet of thinking, in terms of, are you feeding yourself a diet of thoughts that conflict with your values, or that discount your values or ignore them in some way? Somehow those two seem connected to me.
Yeah, I think they're all, a lot of interconnection really with all the tools, for sure.
And then tool number 3 is the door. I wonder if you can say a few things about that.
The only one we've missed, I think.
Okay. So, I think I may have alluded to it without referring to it specifically, but I think about the door as being most helpful for that finger trap dilemma. So this idea of developing willingness to turn towards our own inner experiences instead of pushing them away. And the tool of the door really came out of my own experiences in therapy. I have the privilege of working with some really wonderful therapists who integrated a lot of mindfulness into our work together. The idea of the door was really, could I open up the door and see what would come into the room? And sometimes it would be this part of myself that was holding this deep grief or sadness. Or there's part of myself, this, the angry adolescent, who is just, sort of pushed down all that anger. I became the very, sort of perfect, well-behaved person. But underneath that, I think that, there was a lot of anger that I hadn't acknowledged. And so opening the door and being willing to drop into that experience and to observe what comes in. I have this little acronym, kind of dropping into your body, opening the door, the willingness to turn towards the experience, observing what shows up, what does it look like, what does it feel like, where is it in the body, what might it say if it could speak, and then this R of the door of really reaching out to these parts of us that we might otherwise disown or push away or cut off, and as if we could sit side by side with the hurting or feeling pain the way we would sit with a good friend and hold them in a compassionate space and bring our own presence to these parts of us that might be suffering.
We may wish that some of the guests who show up at the door would just go away, but there are compelling reasons to open the door and welcome them in. So why should we be present to these uncomfortable guests?
Yeah, and I guess I say that, there's a caveat there that I think that there's a time and a place, and it's important that, I'm certainly not advocating people just sort of throw open the door and, dive in. And especially during the pandemic, during this time, I think we have to be really delicate and careful, and certainly self-compassion for sure. But there are times when it may not be appropriate to just dive in because it could be too overwhelming. And certainly for anybody who's experienced trauma or profound loss or things, to be able to have the guidance of a mental health professional can be sometimes essential. So that being said, my own experience is that as I've allowed myself to touch into some of my own deepest pain, there's a real wholeness that comes from that, experiencing myself as whole and being able to experience, I guess, as John Kabat-Zinn says, the full catastrophe, that it's all part of the same coin, if you will, two sides of the same coin, that as we can hold our own suffering, we also open up to this tremendous depth of experience of life, of being alive, of trusting our inner capacity to bear life's challenges. Each of these mental habits that I write about, I kind of see as having a gift. Each one sort of has a gift in it. And I love the Zen proverb that says, obstacles do not block the path, they are the path. And so it's not about getting rid of these mental habits. Again, it's not possible to do that, and that's not the goal. But it's how do we relate to these mental habits in a different kind of a way. And in that, there's a gift. And so with the door, I think one of the gifts is really kind of growing inner resource of trust and acceptance of our own inner experience, and trusting our ability to be with what is here and to experience from that a sense of wholeness that arises.
It's beautifully said, yeah.
And being present to these emotions also not only transforms these emotions, but also transforms us and makes for a much richer life and experience.
Yeah, definitely.
In your book, Gifts of the Rain Puddle, you share your poems, but also you write how poetry is a kind of mindfulness meditation, or can be.
Yeah.
In a way, you demonstrate and model how these tools that we're talking about in this book can be applied and what they would look like in real life, or what might the content be like if you apply them. Is very moving material.
Thank you. Yeah. I really, it's interesting. I started writing poetry when I was 6, I think. And I still have the original bag of poems. I would just scroll them out on a piece of paper and kind of shove them into this bag.
Oh, I love it.
Right in my closet. I could pull it out and show you. But,
so cool.
So I have all these little, scraps of paper and so forth. But I think at that age, and I, of course, knew nothing about mindfulness, but it was really like, for me, mindfulness in motion in some ways, that it was about getting very present with what I was feeling and connecting in with my body and connecting in with these felt sense of whatever was here and somehow finding words for it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who also does some creative writing, I can completely relate to that experience. You sort of, there's something very focusing about, when you sit down and you start to decide you're going to write a poem or whatever the poem comes to you, or sometimes, depending on, how you write, but that it does kind of, there's this quality of coming out of the moment that can happen, whether it's like, for myself, either kind of creating that space and seeing what arises, or sometimes the moment is so whatever evocative that then it sort of pops into my head unexpectedly,
Yeah, I have the similar, I think, experience in the writing.
Yeah.
And sometimes finding out of my meditations, a poem will just emerge. I had that recently with just during this pandemic, some, emotions coming up, and just then being able to kind of put that into words. But a lot of times for me, my poetry has been a way of really being present to some of these deeper parts of myself, and sometimes the difficult parts. But somehow, as I can put words to what I'm experiencing, it does help to transform that experience in a way that brings a bit more ease to it, I find.
Yeah, it is bringing a sort of space and curiosity and an openness to that experience. Yeah.
Yeah.
You also write about how poetry can convey powerful messages so concisely and with such impact, a bit like the experience your father has maybe as a piano student. Like, you really get it, instead of someone giving you an essay.
Right.
This is why you should be positive. It's like, whoa.
Yeah.
It's like a flash of insight. Yeah.
I find good poetry certainly does that.
Yeah. Well, and the Gifts of the Rain Puddle, I'll just mention, because I know maybe some of our listeners, I know that a lot of people find poetry inaccessible or challenging. But I did not experience your poetry that way at all. And also it's, the book is poetry, but also meditations and reflections as well. Would maybe just say a few sentences about the kind of bird's eye view of that book so people know what it's all about.
Yeah. So my poetry, I think of it as fairly accessible. It's just sort of expression of whatever I'm experiencing in the moment. But the idea of the book was really trying to inspire kind of mindfulness in others by just helping, maybe as people read my own experiences, touching into this universality, this common humanity of emotions and experiences that we all feel. And so I have in there some poems and then what I call more meditations, just kind of invitations, just poetic little meditations that can inspire mindful moments, and also some questions for reflection, just to have people ponder some deeper questions, deeper meaning of things.
And you also have some guided material on your website, I will point out. And, if there's anything that people who are enjoying this conversation and want to, learn more from you, how might they be able to do that? What are you up to? How can they find you in the world?
Yeah. So one of the best ways would be my website, which is fairly simple, bethkurland.com. And on my website, I have a number of free resources, some free audio and video meditations. I have a little workshop on stress and different, and lots of inspirational blogs. And there's also a contact form there too. So that's probably the easiest way for people to reach me. And I also have meditations on Insight Timer, and my books are on Amazon.
Great. We will put all that stuff in our show notes so people can access it easily and find their way to you. So thank you so much, Beth. This has been a great conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's truly been a pleasure.
Many thanks.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.